The sun had not yet burned the dust when Mara and Lila were pushed out of their small house and told to leave like old furniture. They stood on the threshold with bare feet in the cool morning earth while their mother unbuttoned her apron with a look that felt like an accusation. The neighbors watched without moving. The word banished fell from their father's mouth as if it were a sentence carved in stone. They walked away before the sun climbed, their shoulders small and packed with shame. The village kept its distance, as if shame were contagious, and the wind smelled of stale cassava and drying laundry. Mara was 21 and Lila was 19. Mara had knuckles thick from carrying water, hands that could open a gate and close a wound. Lila had a laugh that came from the ribs and a scar across her eyebrow left by a broken bottle the year she traded silence for a shout. They had grown up under a corrugated roof where the smell of stewed beans and metal oil mingled with the sharp tang of cigarettes. Their names were said with the same voice the townspeople used to admonish stray dogs. "You will not bring trouble here," their mother said. "You have always been a problem," their father said. Mara answered quietly, "We will find a place." Lila touched her sister's wrist and said, "We leave before we say too much." Their neighbor Rosa stood at her gate and stared but did not speak. Tomos the shopkeeper shook his head and pretended to sweep. The market woman spat into the dust. The sisters gathered the few things they owned, a blanket, a rusted kettle, a tin cup, a symbol photo of them laughing at a wedding, and wrapped them in the blanket like a small offering. They left behind the backyard mango tree where they had first learned to climb, and the patch of earth where their father grew peppers. The sound of their bare feet on the dirt road was a kind of refusal. At a small rise, they turned and looked back once. The house was a rectangle of ochre under an indifferent sky. The village carried on with its morning ritual, and the sisters carried on with their plan. They had been told they were unwelcome. They had been told they were shame. They chose to walk toward the noise of the city and not toward the comfort of pity. They traveled light and fast. The road to the city was a string of hot stones and passing trucks that blew dust into their faces. They had no map and no money beyond a few coins tucked inside the hem of their blanket. Mara kept the kettle like a talisman, and Lila tied the photograph to her belt. At the first bus stop, a boy tried to steal the tin cup. Mara grabbed his wrist and held him until he sobered and returned it. "Do you always fight people for cups?" Lila asked with a smile that tried to be easy. "Only the ones who think small," Mara replied. Nights were the hardest. They slept under the overpass once, and a stray dog did not let them rest. Once, they traded the blanket for warm bread with a vendor who wanted to hear their story before he closed his stall. A woman named Elena, who ran a soup kitchen in the market, recognized the look of people pushed out and offered them a place to sit for an hour in exchange for cutting vegetables. She did not offer money, but she offered a chair and a bowl, and that was a kind of mercy. Along the way, they met a boy named Julio who knew the shortcuts, and a single old woman who pressed a necklace of glass beads into Lila's palm. "For courage," the woman said. There were small humiliations. A man in a truck told them to get out of the way, and a policeman looked at their clothes as if the dirt had been a confession. But there were also moments of strange kindness. A shoe repairman that they had helped once returned the favor with a pair of worn sneakers so one of them would not have to walk on stones. They arrived in the city with knees scraped, with the scent of cooking oil in their hair, with mouths that remembered the taste of their mother's stew, and a determination like iron. They did not plan to become witnesses to a fight. The city plaza was a busy place where men argued over football and women sold fruit in neat pyramids. A pickpocket moved through the crowd, while a vendor argued over change, and traffic hummed in the distance. A child ran into the street, and a car screeched. A man shoved the child hard, and then struck a woman who tried to take the child away. Mara saw the motion of a closed fist, and felt her body remember every time someone used force to silence someone smaller. She stepped forward before anyone had labeled her an intruder. Lila followed. People watched and took out their phones to record. The man pushed Mara hard against the fountain and spit words that smelled of rage. Mara pushed back. Lila grabbed the man from behind and held him in place. The crowd's recording focused on Lila's face the way it focused on lightning. A vendor screamed, and someone else shouted for the police. The sound of phones clacking into life was like rain on a tin roof. A teenager uploaded the clip within minutes, and the first shares were already counting. "Get off them," a woman cried. "Let them go," an old man said. The man who had pushed the child was bigger, but he had misjudged the two sisters who had lived their lives handling more than the world expected. They did not win by punching. He fell simply because the crowd, once nudged, remembered how to be on the side of the small. The video had a moment when Mara, breathing hard, looks directly into the camera and says, "You cannot hurt what you do not fear." The clip traveled across feeds, picked up by a local station, and then by a sports channel that liked the way the sisters moved, the way they countered force with steady balance. Within a day, their faces were in headlines. A journalist named Samir messaged them through a social account and asked to meet. A local trainer sent a comment that said simply, "Do you know how to fight, or do you know how to change the fight?" The world that had banished them sat up and leaned in, curious, hungry to see what would come next. If you felt something watching that clip, you are not alone. That quick moment when two people stepped between violence and the vulnerable is the sort of thing that stays in people for reasons they cannot explain. If the scene made you take a breath and think about the people you pass on the street, write down a memory in the comments. Have you ever stepped in when someone needed you and felt small afterward, or big afterward, or both? Type, "I stepped in," and add one sentence about what happened. Your story will matter here. When you share it, you become part of a conversation that shows small acts build weight. This channel collects stories of people who left, of people who returned, and of the ways our communities either make room or push away. We read these comments and sometimes reach out to people with similar experiences to help them find resources and support. Sharing one sentence could be the beginning of someone else finding the courage to leave or the courage to stay and make a place safer. Now back to Mara and Lila and the train that started with one viral clip and did not stop. Samir arrived with a notepad the next morning, and the trainer came that afternoon. The trainer was Amara, a woman in her mid-40s who ran a small gym that smelled of old leather, liniment, and sweat. She had eyes that watched like someone who had learned not to be surprised. Amara offered coffee and an invitation to the gym. "You have a kind of balance that can be trained," she said. "You have the frame for it and the anger for it." The gym was a low-ceiling space with hanging bags and a cracked floorboard near the ring. It was lit by a single high window that let in dust and sunlight and the echo of shoes hitting the mat. Marco was Amara's assistant, a former amateur boxer with a laugh that came out of his throat. Elena, who had given them the kitchen shift, introduced them to Amara and said they saved a child. Amara asked for details, and when they told the story, she only nodded and said, "Then let us make it count." The offer was simple food and shelter in exchange for training. Coach Amara introduced them to others at the gym there. There was Nadine, who ran the sport therapy table. There was Julio, who mended gloves and brought tapioca after training. And there was Claire, a representative from a local nonprofit who had been following their story. The city was a collision of urgency and opportunity. The sisters learned quickly that kindness had a face, and that offers sometimes required agreements. Amara explained how training would work. 2 sessions a day, weight work at dawn, technical sparring in the afternoon, and conditioning in the evening. The first days were a cultural shock. Rules, schedules, the idea of paying for space to push yourself. Lila thought it expensive, and Mara thought it necessary. They slept in a small room at the back of the gym where the mattress smelled like liniment and old newspaper. The gym became a new home, but also a glass where their reflections were measured. Training was a slow and painful re-engineering of their bodies and minds. The program Mara designed began with baseline endurance tests, where they ran laps around the block while carrying a weighted bag that they learned to hold like a shield. The process had a method to it, and Amara explained it one morning in a voice that combined tenderness with drill sergeant precision. "First, we build the engine," she said. "We run until the muscles learn to keep going. Then we teach the frame to take blows and to give them back. Then we train the brain to decide, not out of panic, but out of choice." The conditioning routine described in detail involved timed intervals of running, strength circuits, and recovery breathing drills. Each session lasted between 90 and 120 minutes a day, with specific sets of plyometrics and core stabilization exercises that targeted balance, footwork, and hip rotation. Amara adjusted their nutrition, with Elena coordinating donated proteins and vegetables. The technical sessions showed them how to position their hands to protect the ribs, how to shift weight from back foot to front foot, and how to use an opponent's momentum. The first week was filled with sick muscles and bad tempers. Nadine worked evenings on soft tissue and taught them stretches that eased cramps. Marco taught them how to wrap hands and how to make gloves last longer. Julio always had a thermos of warm broth and a grin that said, "You can get through it." The coaches kept notes as if their bodies were manuscripts to be edited. They measured progress with timed drills and with sparring notes. They filmed sessions and analyzed movement frame by frame, like a craftsman studying wood grain. The training descriptions read almost clinical, yet lived in the bodies. A mechanic's manual for resilience. Mara's backstory wove through training like a scar that told a story. She had grown up carrying water from the river before sunup, pulling weeds in the market after school, and learning how to wrestle a goat into a pen at 12. Her mother had taught her to sew a button and to hide a bruise with the hem of a dress. Her father, who once worked as a mason, had a true love of land and believed in exact lists and harsh lessons. Mara learned to count bricks and to read the sky. When she was 16, a storm took the roof of the shack, and her father blamed her for not fastening the tarpaulin. She had held the weight of responsibility from early on and had a way of steadying others simply by being there. She had taught Lila how to lock a door and how to make a quick splint. In the city, training was the first time she had allowed someone else to tell her what strength felt like. She recorded every improvement with a small, proud smile when she could hold a plank for an extra 30 seconds, or when her footwork no longer had a hitch. Her backstory sat at about 900 characters in her mind, a compact ledger of work and withheld anger, and an early taste of being told she did not belong. Lila's backstory was the other side of that coin, and it sounded different when she spoke. She had been younger and more likely to lash out because the world had taught her that laughter had to be protected. When she was 8, a boy in school had spread a rumor, and her teacher refused to look up. She learned to defend herself by speaking first, by making jokes bigger than the moment, because humor was the currency no one had taken away. She worked in a small stall selling necklaces and learned the art of bartering and of reading faces. When their mother began to favor the neighbors over them, Lila tried to win approval by cleaning the stove until the metal shone, but that was never enough. She had a faint scar across her eyebrow from a thrown glass, and when she looked at it now, she thought of the feeling of being smaller than the expectations of her parents. In training, Lila found a place to direct the laugh and the anger into something that moved her body instead of words. She kept a journal of small wins and drew lines on a wall to mark progress. Her backstory took shape in the gym, and in the way she refused to be polite when polite meant invisible. They trained with a focus on practical drills and on building tactical awareness. There was a session that Amara called the compass drill, which taught them how to create angles that made an opponent miss twice before they could adjust. The technique was explained in a short procedural sequence that lasted 300 characters or so, and included foot pivot, a slide step, and a shoulder. Feint repeated in sets of 10. Another process involved recovery breathing and cognitive resetting after a hit, which required tight diaphragmatic breaths followed by a visual focusing routine lasting 60 seconds. Each of these procedures was taught with hands-on coaching and repetition until the motion became reflex. They filmed mock matches and rewound sequences to point out micro-adjustments. Coach Mara made them practice falling safely and rising calmer than before. The training was everywhere rigorous and precise, and sometimes cruel enough to reveal softness. Their first public match came sooner than either had expected. The organizer of a regional amateur tournament had seen their viral clip and offered them a slot as a novelty that quickly turned into a test of their preparedness. In the arena, the lights were harsh and the crowd felt like a living thing. The ring smelled of rosin and sweat, and the audience cheered in pockets like waves. The announcer called their names into a microphone that made everything sound monumental. Mara felt the old tremor of fear in her hands, and the gym had taught her how to turn that tremor into alertness. The match was a sequence of technical moments: footwork to evade a straight punch, a counter hook to the rib, and a clinch that drained the opponent's momentum. The crowd roared when Lila executed a sweep she had practiced until midnight when the gym lights were off. The judges scored them with narrow margins, but in the end, a photograph caught Mara raising Lila's hand like a ribbon moment, and the result was a win that meant more than points. It was a public acknowledgement that the city had once seen a spectacle, now recognized as talent. The media gathered, and Claire, the nonprofit representative, wrote a press release that framed the victory as more than a personal achievement. "This is about opportunity," she told a reporter. The win brought not only recognition, but a professional offer to travel and to train abroad. It was the kind of choice that had cost attached. The offer was a contract from an international trainer who saw potential for branding and sponsorship. It required leaving the gym for an extended training camp, and it promised exposure and money. The moment introduced a dilemma. Mara considered the promise of income that could buy land back home, that could buy a building, a center, a place where no one would be turned out. Lila thought about the young girls they had met in the market who looked at them with wide eyes. The decision to go abroad was not only personal, it was a moral negotiation. The training overseas was tougher, and the cultural adjustment was heavy. They flew for the first time, and the airplane cabin smelled of recycled coffee and perfume. The new trainer, a man named Victor, had a different style. He praised performance and demanded compliance. The city and the foreign country had wider sidewalks and people who ate breakfast. They lived in a small apartment above a bakery that smelled of butter and sugar. Marco kept in touch by voice messages, and Amara sent them packages of dried spices from home. Lila woke up one morning with a sharp pain in her ankle from an old twist that had been ignored. The coach arranged for a doctor, and Nadine consulted through calls. The injury was minor, but it generated a question about the cost of success and the weight of leaving a place where promises were not only about trophies, but about the ways you could change a town. During the months abroad, they learned to navigate promotion calls, sponsor meetings, and contract negotiations. The process of agreeing terms for a sponsorship included a clause about image rights and required reading documents that spelled out payment schedules, training expectations, and obligations to attend events. The negotiation process was explained in a 300-character procedural summary and involved requesting clear deliverables, setting a timeline, and confirming travel logistics. They accepted a deal that allowed them to keep part of earnings and to allocate a percentage to a fund for their future project. But success abroad also came with a corrosive side. Some promoters wanted to package them as exotic or as a novelty rather than as serious athletes. They encountered offers that felt like shortcuts to fame and replies that felt like traps. They learned to say no and to hold out for terms that respected their autonomy. There were nights when Lila woke up dizzy with homesickness, and others when Mara sat at the window and counted stars and imagined the mango tree they had left behind. After 2 seasons of wins and interviews and small endorsements, they decided to return. They chartered a bus and traveled back with a little money and a plan that had been written on clinic paper and in the margins of their journals. They arrived at the edge of the village the same way they had left, with dusty shoes and a small team. The return was dramatic and quiet at the same time. Some faces recognized them, and others did not. Their father stood in the doorway of the house and did not speak at first. People gathered. There was a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. They had money enough to buy the small plot of land opposite the old mango tree, and they had a legal document to show for it. The purchase required a process of negotiating with a local landowner, an administrative review, and a registered deed.
The legal process took weeks and included drafting a purchase agreement, obtaining community signatures, and registering the transfer at the municipal office. The description of this acquisition process was technical and clean, containing several sentences about notarization and land title checks, and lasted about 300 characters in explanation. When they filed the papers, they felt like they had placed a flag in a map that had once excluded them.
The town meeting was heated. Their mother, Rosa, attended with a face that had been softened by time. Tomás, the shopkeeper, who had once shrugged, now offered a tin of paint. The mayor, Lucia, a woman with a taste for civic theater, came to the unveiling and asked for a speech. The sisters stood before the small crowd with keys in their hands and said the words that turned an old shame into a plan. They announced a center, a place where girls could come to train, learn skills, and feel safe. The opening of the center was the kind of scene that would later be used in campaign photos. The building was modest, a single story, with a training room with mats, a small classroom, and a courtyard under the mango tree. The paint smelled of citrus and new wood, and the sound of training shoes on mats replaced the gossip that had once filled the air. They hired members of the community, including Julio to manage equipment, Nadine to run physiotherapy, and Marco to teach fundamentals. They invited Amara and Claire and Samir, who came and reported on the scene like a witness to a transformation. The center offered classes that combined physical training with legal clinics and literacy sessions. The curriculum included warm-up routines, footwork drills, and confidence workshops. And each process was described to volunteers in a concise document that outlined objectives and timelines. It was not only a gym, it was a hub where practical skills and civic education met. The first day, 200 girls came, and they filled the courtyard with voices and movement. Parents who had once scorned them brought their children, and it was a difficult and beautiful rearrangement of long-held prejudices. Some people still whispered, but many more shouted encouragement. The sisters could hardly believe it. They had returned to a place that tried to close its doors and opened them now along lines they had helped redraw. There were moments of tension that tested their resolve. Once, a local politician tried to use the center as a venue for a campaign promise and demanded exclusive access. Mara refused and Lila stood beside her. The confrontation lasted for hours and was a tangle of raised voices and offers that smelled of bribery. They debated whether to take the resources and risk losing control or to hold firm and potentially lose funding. The argument was resolved when Claire and a small coalition of parents organized a petition and the community supported the sisters publicly. Another tense moment occurred when a rival trainer from a neighboring town accused them of recruiting unfairly and filed a complaint with the regional association. The complaint forced them to produce registration documents, proof of training certifications, and a roster of participants. It required days of paperwork and nights of worry. They gathered the documents and presented them, and the complaint was dismissed. There was also a private crisis when Lila considered and offered to leave again for a lucrative contract that would have diverted funds from their nascent project. She sat awake and fought with the idea that leaving could fund growth but could also mean abandoning the center when it needed her. She ultimately chose to stay and to accept smaller contracts that allowed her to support the center. Each tension refined them like steel under hammer. Months passed, and the center became a presence. The media returned with profiles, and Samir wrote a piece that tracked the change. Sponsors offered small grants, and a local university partnered to bring volunteers. The training program produced measurable results. 10 girls who had started fit enough to compete in regional events, and some of them won medals. The center employed young people from the village and used proceeds to buy more mats and to start a scholarship fund. The mango tree bore fruit that first season, and the courtyard filled with laughter. They measured impact in numbers and in faces, and in the way parents now asked about class schedules. The project had ripple effects. Local shops gained customers, and a newly formed association for women's economic empowerment met in the center to plan microloans.
The sisters were invited to speak at municipal meetings, and they used those platforms to push for policies that protected girls from arbitrary eviction and that created sporting scholarships for low-income families. The epilogue came in 3 snapshots that showed gradual consolidation. 1 month after the opening, the center ran its first full week of classes and had an average attendance of 120 youth. The girls learned basic footwork and self-defense, and they practiced daily drills that taught breathing and focus. The town began to schedule its market days around the free classes to encourage participation. 3 months later, the center had added a literacy program and partnered with a local clinic to provide monthly health checkups. A small team of volunteers organized workshops on local law and on how to register small businesses. And 3 of the center's trainees had registered their own stalls, selling handmade crafts and snacks. 6 months in, the center had an established scholarship fund and had produced a regional champion, a young woman who had been with Mara and Lila from the first week, and who now held a medal that glittered like a promise. The agricultural cooperative planted a row of mangoes whose saplings had been bought with a part of the sponsorship funds, and the economic activity had increased in the village. The narrative of banishment had been rewritten into a ledger of community value. In the end, they returned not to punish, but to build. The shame that had once made them leave became the very engine that powered a center that taught strength, both physical and civic. They redeployed their success by creating jobs, sponsoring education, and offering a shelter to those who needed to leave home. Their names changed meaning. No longer were they only the girls who had been pushed away. They had become leaders who could sign documents, who could stand in municipal halls, and who could counsel a scared parent. The mango tree that had marked their childhood became the shade under which 100 children practiced layups and lunges. The legal deed sat in a frame in the office, and when someone asked what mattered most, they would say the people. Today, the center serves hundreds monthly, employs local staff, and has a small fund that supports competitive opportunities outside the region. They kept their promise to themselves and to the girls who came after them. If this story moved you, subscribe for more stories of people who turned rejection into legacy. Because these are not tales of miracle happenstance, but of planning, labor, and community. Join this channel to follow the next chapter and to support projects that help others rebuild. And remember that leaving can sometimes be the first step toward coming back with the power to change everything.